Hiya, Ten. It's Friday again, so it's good to see you for another unseen poetry video. I hope you're all doing really well and you're staying cheerful and happy, and you and your families are safe. If you're anything like me, the repetitive routine of lockdown is probably becoming a bit of a trial by now. But one of the highlights of my routine, actually, certainly from a work point of view, is doing this work on unseen poetry. And this week in particular, I want to say thank you for really, really interesting points and questions that you sent in about the poem, which have expanded my thinking about the poem really by it sort of engaging with some of the points that you guys made. So I'm looking forward to going through those today, and thank you very much. Um, it's a poem with quite a lot of symbols in there, or quite a lot of images which we might see as symbolic. So some of them on the screen now. You've got the incident tape around the edge of the graveyard, as well as the padlock and the hawthorn hedge. So all of these things keeping people out. When it talks about the candy striped helix, that's just describing the shape of that tape there, and also the colour, the striped pattern. Obviously, graves are a big image in terms of death. The moon is a big image in poetry, and then we've got allied to that cosmic image of the moon, mentions the universe, the astronaut, although we know the astronaut is really the gravedigger wearing the protective hazardous materials suit. And then we finish on this powerful image of the ambulance. So one of the things about this poem, as well as it telling a story of somebody on a walk and they describe what they see, we also have these ways into the poem through these symbols, ways into the poem, but also ways out into wider thinking about, well, what does this poem want us to consider? What ideas is it opening up to? So lots of you spoke about one or more of these in your comments, and so I'll talk about them a little bit when we go through the poem shortly. I'll read it through once now, so you can have a reminder of the poem itself. Still life. The local cemetery's out of bounds, entrance draped with a candy-striped helix of incident tape, chain and padlock reeving the gate. We'll edge past on a path that slaloms the hawthorn hedge, exchange stares with the astronaut in hazmat suit and visor and mask and overshoes, on white leather gloves, propped on his spade at an open grave. The universe breathless and muggy tonight. A cold-blooded moon, marooned villages under the hill, a stagnant dusk that parts to allow an ambulance through. Okay, so a poem that's full of symbols, but not necessarily a poem with a clear message. The voice of the poem, we don't get a first person, but we get the sense of, or mostly we don't get the first person, we get a little bit of first person plural. We get a sense of a group on a walk, but we're told what they see. We're not directly told a person's feelings in the same way that we have been in the previous two poems, the two love poems that we've looked at. So that's something we're going to have to tease out a little bit. What sense do we get as to how is the voice feeling in this situation which we're all living through at the moment? So various questions to be answered then as we dig into the poem. Here are some of your questions on the board, or on the screen rather, and we'll try and make sure we cover all of those during the video. The last one should say who is the ambulance for at the end, not how is the ambulance for at the end. But we'll save the end to the end. Some of your other questions are actually about structure, so maybe we'll talk a little bit about that first. One person asked, why is it in 9 3-line stanzas? And another person asked, why does it have such an unusual structure? It is quite unusual. The shortness of the lines is quite unusual. It's broken up. One person suggested that was to slow down the pace, so we get the sense of the slowness that life seems to sometimes have now at the moment when lots of things are closed down. One person said the enjambment, the way that sentences drift from line to line, and actually sometimes for 7 or 10 lines, 9 lines, these sentences drifting line after line after line. One person said that creates a drowsy and mournful effect, like a scream of sorrow. And as well as the idea of a slow pace, there's this idea of brokenness. So maybe our lives are broken up into different compartments now at the moment. We're separated from each other, so our communities, our society is broken up into bits. Maybe the structure of the poem could be seen slightly to reflect that. That might be one reason why he's gone for these very short lines and stanzas rather than longer ones. The poem's quite interesting as well, so the title, I should say, is quite interesting as well. Still life. If you were to Google that phrase, or if you just ask someone, well, what's still life? You might get a sort of painting of a bowl of fruit or something like that. That idea of an image of something, a picture of something. And I guess it gives us a picture or a snapshot from the poet's experience, if we judge it to be autobiographical, albeit not perhaps the kind of picture you might traditionally expect of still life. So you've got that idea of here's a picture, still life, but then you can tease out other meanings as well from that title. So you might think, this is still life. Put it in a longer sentence. Everything's slowed down, everything's stopped, we're not in school, we can't do lots of the things that we'd normally do, but it's still life. Life is still happening, albeit in this kind of slightly weird, slowed down way. And then that leads on to another possible interpretation. Still life. Life has been stilled, it's been stopped, it's been freeze-framed. And the poet is trying to explore that experience, or try and explain to himself as well as to his readers, what is it like to live a still or a stilled life, a life that's on pause. Okay, so let's have a look a bit closer. We'll start to go stanza by stanza, and we'll look at some of the points that people raised. So the first lines then, the local cemeteries out of bounds. There's an interesting thing one person said about that. So on the one hand, it's a statement of fact. The graveyard's been closed off, you can't walk through it. But there's also this sense, the idea, the cemetery's out of bounds, it's kept hidden. And particularly then with the third line, the entrance is draped. A drape being pulled over something, it's been covered up. You maybe get this sense, well, certainly one student got the sense that you've got a community that's in denial. They want to drape over this reality of death and keep it hidden, keep it in the background. I found that really interesting. I always remember reading a book by George Orwell, Coming Up for Air, and the main character in that book speaks about how in the past the graveyard was always in the centre of a village, and it was in the middle of people's lives, and so it was a reality. And then at some point, graveyards tended to get moved to the edge of the village and sort of hidden out of sight, and he equated that with this idea that people are in denial about the reality of death and what's coming ultimately for everyone. So I thought it was interesting that one student who got in touch found that idea in this poem here. So the entrance is draped, but then we read on into the second stanza with a candy stripe helix, and a few people said, well, what's this, and is it symbolic? As I said before, it's a way of describing the tape. Sometimes you see it at crime scenes, don't you, police tape, but incident tape sort of perhaps wrapped around the gate or around the fence just to reiterate to people, don't come in. So again, on a literal level, that's what it is. But candy stripe helix, obviously there's all sorts of ways the writer could have described that tape. It could just be red and white tape or plastic tape. So then you look at candy stripe and helix and say, well, what's going on here? It's quite interesting, quite unusual word choices. One person, or a couple of people actually, I think, picked up on candy stripe and this idea of candy and stripes is quite cheerful, isn't it? Positive. And you've got this sort of mismatch almost between the idea of incident tape, which might be linked to a crime or a death, and then this sort of positive, innocent associations of candy and maybe striped rock and things like that, maybe trying to make something grim appear more cheerful, or just feeding in to a pattern throughout the whole poem that we get two things side by side at the same time. Something sort of miserable and foreboding and threatening alongside something that's more positive. And maybe that juxtaposition is just sort of speaking to the strangeness of life at the moment, which is one of the topics or themes of this poem. Then you've got the helix, and a helix is like a curve or a curl, but if I think of a helix, the first thing I think of is the DNA helix, and that made me think, well, have we got something, a reference here then to human nature or the truth about us? Is the poet nodding to that? And if so, what does he want us to sort of think about or pick up on in that particular context? And I'll not necessarily give the answer to that because I'm not sure, but something for you to think about as we go through the rest of the poem. Here as well, incident tape. As I said before, police tape, see it at crimes. Well, this poem's not describing a crime. It's really about a disease, isn't it? A pandemic, which is something natural, whereas a crime is a human act of choice. And a question to ask yourself again: is it just incident tape because lots of sort of fields or areas are blocked off with that kind of tape at the moment, or is there some question being asked about, well, who's to blame here? And maybe if we're thinking about human nature and blame, it's almost human nature that we look for someone to blame for what's happening, even if it's sort of an act that's largely, or a circumstance I should say, that's largely beyond human control. So the field is surrounded, it's blocked off by the tape, also by the padlock, and as well as the gate, and they edge past then. They're walking past, and it's not easy to walk past by the sound of it. They're slaloming, so going in and out as they move past the hawthorn hedge. So one person asked about the hawthorn hedge. Why a hawthorn hedge? Obviously, there's a hedge around the graveyard, and maybe it's just being descriptive by telling us what sort of a hedge. But then again, is there a particular significance of the hawthorn hedge? And the student's suggestion was that they're prickly and resilient, and that maybe says something about life getting harder or about people having to be resilient to cope with the current situation. But could it be something else? And I thought, well, there's an interesting question. And I looked it up, and actually, traditionally, there are some quite interesting symbolisms attached to hawthorn. But I'm going to come back to that later on, actually. I'm also going to pause just now at that point in the poem, and I'll be back shortly with part 2 of the video. So we've got this sort of semantic field of blockages, of barriers, hedges and gates and locks and tape. And at the moment, I suppose, there are lots of blocks and barriers between us and our desires and our freedom. So that is one thing that's been introduced in the first part of the poem, and we'll look at some of the other ideas in the subsequent stanzas in a few moments when I'm back with part 2. Thanks a lot.